I have mostly really good things to say about this lens, but I can't emphasize one thing enough. This 70-200 weighing less than this 24-70 is a true technical wonder. I'll say it. It is noticeable when you hold the two of them, and it's noticeable when shooting with the 70-200 f4. Straight up, I did not see myself liking this lens, an f4 lens, as much as I do, but consider me very impressed. Welcome back to the channel, everyone. I'm Chris Hagan, a video producer and photographer here in the Pacific Northwest, and curiosity has once again gotten the best of me. I love Sony's 70-200 f2.8 Mark II, but I don't own it because I don't think I'd use it quite enough. I have rented it from time to time for shooting weddings and events as a side business. Lately, however, I've gravitated toward Tamron's 35-150 f2.8 for weddings due to its versatility. For the camera I keep on a tripod, that lens can live there and get every shot I need while I roam elsewhere with prime lenses. Still, it's a hefty lens. It's nearly 400 grams heavier than the lens we're talking about in today's video. And one of my very few complaints about that Tamron lens is how it balances in the hand and how it feels when shooting for extended periods of time. Enter the 70-200 f4 Mark II from Sony. It's a refresh of a really solid Mark I lens, but clearly Sony knew they had to do something to make it special and make it worth buying at $1,700. More on that price later. What makes this a special telephoto zoom is its size. Like I said at the start, it's lighter than Sigma's 24-70 DGDN f2.8, a trait that we just can't overlook because that's what separates the 70-200 from a crowded field of telephoto zooms, some of which are even brighter at f2.8. We'll get to the competition later, but for now let's talk about this lens. We'll talk about some of the best use cases for this lens and put it through its paces with some sports photography at the Eugene Marathon here in Oregon. I also got a good feel for its video chops and image stabilization while filming all over the range. Spoiler alert, it performed really solid in that category. I also took a few headshots with it because if you're gonna pay the Sony tax for this lens, you better be able to use it in a variety of situations. And if you wanna skip ahead or jump around to things like image quality, autofocus, or design, time codes are in the description, and don't sleep on design because I think that's the most interesting and valued trait that this thing has going for it. So, first off, who is this f4 zoom lens for? I think it's for someone who finds themselves shooting outdoor events and sports, mainly because of its limitations with aperture. If you're shooting indoors a lot, especially events where there could be dim lighting, that f4 aperture could present some problems. For weddings, however, that's interesting. I have used Sony's 70-200 f4 Mark I before and didn't have any issues with it, but that's because I'm usually only using telephoto zooms for the ceremony, which should be well lit, and maybe during toast at the reception. If you don't bring your own, good lighting isn't always guaranteed in that scenario, in which case I'd probably just switch to my 85 prime that shoots down to f1.4. My point is, there are other options if an f2.8 aperture is vital to your work, and again, we'll talk about that later. But in the case of daytime sports, f4 is plenty. And trust me, I'm an aperture snob most of the time. But the more you shoot, photo or video, the more you realize you don't always need to be shooting wide open with a super shallow depth of field. So with that said, let's look at some of the photos from the Eugene Marathon and image quality. Again, if you need an f2.8 aperture, you know who you are. If not, or if you don't know, I highly recommend at least renting this lens like I did to see if it can satisfy your needs. Shooting at f4 for the marathon, really no complaints. And I think everyone's first worry is subject separation compared to an f2.8 zoom. But again, in that 70-200 range, that really shouldn't be too much of an issue. The next concern might be how high your ISO needs to be to freeze the action. I played it safe for the most part, shooting above a 1/800th of a second shutter speed. A lot of shots were even 1/1600th of a second, and at f4 that put my ISO anywhere from 1000 to 1600 in some overcast weather on the A7 IV. Still, I did do some light editing to a few, adding a preset that I found really pushed and pulled the colors a bit and brought out some of the artifacts and the noise. Not sure why, maybe one of you can help, but with noise reduction applied in Lightroom and a little grain added back for some texture, I did like the result. And side note, I do think that sometimes your images can start looking plasticky, if that's a word, when trying to use noise reduction on higher ISO frames. So as good of a tool as it can be, it has its limits if you still want a natural looking image. When shooting in more controlled lighting, like using a flash for some headshots, I was able to slow down my shutter speed a bit and lower my ISO. And the lens was really, really sharp. I used the sun as a bit of a rim light during sunset in the backyard and absolutely loved these results. Looking at autofocus, again, flawless operation in terms of photo and video in my opinion. And this is on the A7 IV, a camera that's more than 2 years old now and missing some of Sony's latest features like AI autofocus, and it certainly doesn't have the speed of something like the A1 or A9 II or A9 III. This lens's autofocus was built to keep up with those higher speeds of shooting up to 120 frames per second, so handling the A7 IV's 10 is no sweat. And personally, I shoot lossless compressed on my A7 IV, which I believe caps me at 6 frames per second. I was shooting mechanical shutter and either low or mid speed from there. And going through my images, it looks like I only missed maybe one shot in the short burst that I took. Where I came away most impressed was where the quick focusing of this lens actually saved me. I was at the marathon with family supporting my sister-in-law who was running to qualify for the Boston Marathon, and congrats to her because she did. But where we caught her the first time during the race was around mile 8, and she was still in a bit of a crowd, and it turned out she was wearing different attire than she planned. So we never saw her coming. She saw us first and made her way toward us to say hi. Normally she might pause for a bit, but not with Boston on the brain. So I only got 3 frames of her running by, and all 3 frames hit. I usually use the smallest or second smallest spot focus and tracking to make sure I'm locking onto my target, and this went off without a hitch. For a marathon, I really can't think of a much better test than that. As for video autofocus, similar case. We caught a lot of runners toward the end of the race entering Hayward Field, which was a perfect place to test some of the tracking. I did some touch to focus, which worked well following runners around the curve and into the stadium. I also used the small focus point and tried to keep that focus point on the runners a few times to see how well it tracked them without tap to focus, and it did well. I think in that situation with spectators behind the runners, you risk the focus catching someone in the crowd instead. So that's a time where manual focus might be a better move, but again, no complaints here as far as the lens performance. And speaking of video, what do you think about the stabilization in these shots? I wanted to make sure I filmed at 24 and 60 frames per second. It's pretty easy to keep a steady shot when you're slowing the footage down, but at 24 frames per second, that's where you may see some of the shakes a little bit more. But even zoomed all the way out to 200 millimeters, I was able to keep a pretty steady shot with the camera's in-body stabilization set to active while paired with the lens's image stabilization as well. All of the video I filmed at the race was handheld, and especially with a different body like the A7S III or FX3 that has less of a rolling shutter effect, I don't think you'd have any issue with faster paced shots and this lens. Now, before we get to macro shooting and the design of this lens, which again, you'll probably want to stick around for, I've got a quick request. The channel's been growing a bit and I'd love to keep it that way to keep helping all of you where I can. So if you found this video informative in any way, please do me a favor and drop a like and subscribe for more content like this in the future. So, macro shooting. It's not something that I do a whole lot of, but similar to the compact design, I think it's something Sony needed to throw in to help justify the price tag and set this f4 zoom apart from the others in its lineup and some of the third-party 70-200 options. I took advantage of it by just grabbing a few stills and some video of products and gear that I'll be making videos about in the future, or I just want to have on deck for a later date. It may be a little more niche of a use case, but if it allows you to switch up your B-roll for the better and capture details up close that you otherwise would not, mission accomplished. Finally, to design. I've saved it for last because I think it's probably the most interesting and maybe the most debated, but it's also the biggest selling point to me. In its natural state, it's shorter and pretty light compared to a lot of the lenses in this category, and that comes with its trade-offs depending on how you look at it. It's shorter because it has an external zoom, and I'll be the first to admit, I do not love that, but I do trust that it's a professional lens with professional grade weather sealing, so I'm not as worried about it as I might be with some of the third-party lenses that do zoom externally as well. My gripe with the Tamron 35-150 is that it becomes really front heavy when you extend out to the end of the zoom range, but I didn't get that here with the 70-200 f4 at all. It still felt really comfortable when zoomed all the way out to 200 millimeters, probably because as a whole it weighs less than 800 grams. It can only get so front heavy, especially on a full frame camera body. Another bonus, the shorter length makes it easy to carry, both in my camera bag, where it doesn't take up an entire row of space, and on my body, outside of the bag. Since I had another camera on a camera strap, I used the Peak Design capture clip to carry around the A7 IV and 70-200 hands-free. Now, full disclosure, I have a pretty athletic build and come from a sports journalist background where I used to carry around large cameras and tripods and bags all the time. So there's not much in the mirrorless world that I would consider too heavy to wear on my body. But I think the average person would be able to handle this weight pretty well. And I think that's important when you consider another use case for this lens, which would be hiking and backpacking. Every ounce counts when you're loading up your pack and gear. And if you want a telephoto lens for wildlife or unique shots, this is one that can save you some weight. And I absolutely think that should be factored into the equation if you plan on bringing this lens out frequently. Now, on the lens itself, you've got the usual. There are 3 custom buttons. There's also the usual switches for focus control and focus distance, including that macro mode. There is not, however, an aperture ring, which I've counted against lenses in the past if you're going to use them to shoot video, but truth be told, I don't miss it too much. And if removing that aperture ring allowed them to keep the size and weight and price down from the nearly $3,000 G-Master, I guess I can live with it. Like I said earlier, 70-200 has become a crowded field on the Sony E-mount. You've got 4 options from Sony with their Mark I and Mark II f2.8 and f4 versions. Sigma put out a pretty bulky f2.8 version recently, and Tamron has the 70-180 f2.8 and 35-150 f2 to f2.8. So yeah, there's a lot of competition. And I think the closest is probably Tamron 70-180 Mark II because it's got image stabilization, is only 60 grams heavier and a few millimeters longer, and features an f2.8 aperture. It's also $400 cheaper than Sony's 70-200 f4. So you've got to decide whether you need that extra 20 millimeters of reach on the long end, macro ability, and what may be some better weather sealing, though that wouldn't really be fair of me to say since you can't really test that in such a short period of time. I would like to test that Tamron 70-180 eventually this summer, but for now, what I can say about this Sony 70-200 f4 is it is a professional lens that will serve you very well with image quality. It will save you money compared to the f2.8 G-Master version and save space in your camera bag. If you're someone who swears by only Sony lenses but doesn't want to pay up for the G-Master, this lens is probably for you as long as you don't need great low light performance. If you're an outdoorsman who will probably be shooting in decent light and need to save space, this is also probably the lens for you. If you need a lens that can cover 70-200 and also take a good portrait in controlled lighting, this lens can do that as well. So I hope this does give you a little bit more insight if you had your eye on purchasing this lens. Again, I would like to test the 70-180 from Tamron as well to see if it can sway me, but overall, I've been nothing but impressed by the 70-200 f4, something I just didn't see myself saying. Thanks as always for watching. Drop a like, get subscribed, and I'll see you in the next video.